So Tucker Carlson was in Russia. He was there to interview Vladimir Putin. If you listen to Tucker, you follow him, you'll know that this is an interview he's been trying to do for a number of years. I know myself because I worked for Tucker and his show, Tucker Carlson Tonight, for about 3 years, and this was something that was in the works for a long time. In fact, it was about 2 years ago that he initially began planning this interview with Vladimir Putin, and at the time, the NSA released Tucker's text messages to the media when he was planning this interview. He believed, and I think rightfully so, that that was an attempt to tank the interview before it happened.
Yesterday, we heard from a whistleblower within the U.S. government who reached out to warn us that the NSA, the National Security Agency, is monitoring our electronic communications and is planning to leak them in an attempt to take the show off the air.
And of course, just a few months later, just a few months after those texts were released, a war broke out in Ukraine. So the reaction in this country has been particularly interesting. I mean, you have the usual people on the left attacking Tucker, but what was interesting too were the attacks from the right. You heard people saying, Tucker's a traitor, he's shilling for Vladimir Putin, he's carrying water for the Kremlin, and spreading propaganda on behalf of, I guess, what is the most evil country in the world. That's what they sort of want us to believe now, right? The thing is, many of Tucker's critics, particularly those on the right, the paedo-libertarian free market types, the neocons, they missed the point of his visit entirely. So they fell for, or maybe they even agree with, the mainstream media's narrative about Tucker's propaganda visit to Russia. They agree with that. But if you don't, and if you're watching what Tucker did over there and you're trying to make sense of it all, I mean, maybe there are people on the right who you listen to and who you follow, who you saw criticize Tucker, and you may be asking yourself the same sort of questions. Why was Tucker over there? What was the point of his interview with Vladimir Putin? What was the takeaway of his visit to Moscow? Well, I'll tell you what it is. I know because I briefly spoke with Tucker while he was abroad. I know the team he took with them. I used to work with them. And I know the way that they think. What they were trying to reveal is something that the media and political elite, not just in this country, but in the entire Western world, is working very hard to suppress. It's something they don't want you to know about Russia. It's the things that they don't want you to know about their lifestyle and their way of life. And I think that was the point of Tucker's video. So if you listen to the mainstream media, Russia's a terrible place. It's depressing to live there, the people are poor, it's a gas station with nukes. They always like to say that. And so in some sense, those characterizations are half true. They come from some sort of truth. They're not controversial opinions, but in other ways, those statements are completely wrong. At best, maybe it's an oversimplification of a complex country and culture. I know because I've been to Russia. I went there nearly 6 years ago in 2018, and many of the things Tucker showed in his visit while he was there, I've also seen firsthand. After interviewing Vladimir Putin, Tucker released a series of videos that gave Americans some insight as to what Russia is really like. In fact, Tucker told me the most shocking thing in his view about the entire trip wasn't anything about what Vladimir Putin said or any revelation from the interview, but in fact, it was about how amazing Moscow was. And I think that's something he tried to share with his audience. By now, you've probably seen some of the videos on X, but one of the ways he tried to do that was by depicting Russia's famous, ornate, and luxurious subway stations.
We're standing in front of the Kievskaya metro station, and what we found shocked us. Now, that's not an endorsement of Stalin, who was bad, obviously, nor is it an endorsement of the current president, Vladimir Putin. You may not like him either. But it doesn't change the reality of what we saw, or more precisely, didn't see. There's no graffiti, there's no filth, there are no foul smells, there are no bums or drug addicts or rapists or people waiting to push you onto the train tracks and kill you. No, it's perfectly clean and orderly.
So the immediate reaction to that video was not to say, hey, maybe Tucker's got a point. Our subways actually are getting a little more unsafe. We actually have seen a lot of people thrown onto the tracks in the last few years. You actually do have a high chance of getting raped. I mean, our subways are pretty nasty here. They're collapsing, they're dirty. That wasn't the reaction at all. And in a way, that's sort of a tell, right? It's because our political elite in DC and New York don't use public transit. So what would they know and what would they care? The response that we did see was predictably stupid. You had people on X unironically claiming that none of this matters. Safety in public transit, getting on the subway, none of that stuff matters because Russia jails its political opponents and because Russia doesn't have free speech. And then you had the usual crowd of people citing things like the GDP and median income in Russia. Who cares that the subway's really nice? Their people are more poor than ours. I guess their argument is, well, yes, the New York City subway system is filthy and unsafe, and sure, you do have a pretty high chance of getting pushed onto the tracks, but at least the people here in the United States, at least the people riding the New York City subway have more disposable income and purchasing power and a higher per capita GDP, right? I mean, that's sort of the argument that they're making. So the next thing Tucker did was take his audience inside a Russian grocery store. This was particularly interesting to me because I had the exact same experience and reaction when I was in Russia 6 years ago. We were in a city called Yekaterinburg. It's probably a city you've never heard of before. It's very, very far east, practically in Siberia. It's Russia's fourth largest city, and it's probably best known for being the site where the Romanovs, the czars, the last czar, was exiled with his family and where they were later murdered. The city isn't exactly an aesthetically pleasing place. It's pretty run down. The buildings look like they're crippling, but it is an economic hub for Russia. But to a visitor from the West, it looks like a place that's untouched from the Cold War. It looks like it's lost in time. And despite all of that, the city had one of the nicest grocery stores I'd ever been to. I can't explain why, I don't know what the reason is, but it was a huge store. It was a luxury grocery store filled with all kinds of products, meats, anything you can think of. And honestly, even coming from the United States, they had sort of varieties of any type of product from things that were prepackaged to produce to a fresh food that I even hadn't seen to that level in the United States. And so, look, I'm not saying that those stores don't exist here. It's not to say that we don't have similar stores with similar luxury goods, but the point is the store was nicer than your average Publix, let's say. And so Tucker seemed to have a similar experience himself. Here's part of the video that he released.
It's pretty non-sanctioned to me, but what do I know? I went from amused to legitimately angry. So we were guessing what this would cost. Everybody hears from the United States, buys groceries, and we didn't pay any attention to costs as we were just putting in the cart what we would actually eat over a week. And we all came in around $400, about $400. It was $104 US here. And that's when you start to realize that ideology maybe doesn't matter as much as you thought, corruption. If you take people's standard of living and you tank it through filth and crime and inflation, and they literally can't buy the groceries they want, at that point, maybe it matters less what you say or whether you're a good person or a bad person. You're wrecking people's lives in their country.
Now, Tucker's pretty clear. He's not endorsing Putin or Russia's government. I don't know how you look at someone and say, hey, they have a really nice grocery store here and think that that's an endorsement of the government. He's simply saying, hey, this is a country under economic sanction, and yet their grocery stores are full. The prices are cheaper than what we pay. And again, it's weird. Russia's in the middle of a war. They've been frozen, no thanks to us, out of the international economic system, and it hasn't seemed to hurt them. And so if it hasn't hurt them and they seem to be doing fine, what's the point of it all? Who's really been exposed by all of this? And I think when you look at Tucker's material, that's part of why you had such a visceral, hateful reaction to it all. Is it Russia that's been exposed by Tucker's trip there? Is anyone watching Tucker's videos more or less convinced about what our media have been telling us about Russia since the Ukraine war? On the other hand, is the United States more exposed? Is Joe Biden and his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, are they now more exposed by this type of material? I mean, again, these are the same people who told us that this war was going to be over by now. These are the same people who've told us that sanctions were going to work, that freezing Russia out was going to work. Russia's going to lose this war. Ukraine's going to beat them. So when you look at Tucker's video, when you look at what life is like there, whose narrative is more hurt by it? Is it Russia's narrative or is it the United States? And so the reaction shows that Tucker, and by extension the rest of us, are not allowed to notice these things. You can't say Moscow has a clean and nice subway. Instead, we have to believe that the New York City subway is cleaner and it's safer and it's better than any other subway system in the world. Stop complaining. Forget all the videos you've seen of people smoking weed or having sex on the subway cars, or all the videos of the mentally ill, the homeless, the disturbing other passengers. You're not allowed to notice that, and you're especially not allowed to complain about it. In fact, just a few days ago, there was an article about how despite all the sanctions, the Kremlin has never been richer. They're selling plenty of oil. Their grocery stores, as you saw in Tucker's video, are full. And so I guess for the crime of noticing, people attacked Tucker as a traitor. Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina called him a useful idiot. The women of The View, if you can even call them that, called him a Kremlin puppet. Again, so original, so unique, you've never heard that before. Then, of course, you had people pointing out that in Russia, people make less than they do in the United States. They have a lower median income, the lower per capita GDP. That's why the prices are cheaper. That's what these people are arguing. And so, if technically true, that's sort of missing the point. Because again, the real point is, yes, Russia is a poor country. Yes, their GDP and their per capita media income might be lower than ours. Yet they still manage to have clean, safe streets. Their public transit works, and you can use it without being afraid that you're going to get stabbed or killed or raped or pushed onto the tracks. And so if a poor country can do that, what's our excuse? If you're actually attacking someone for pointing all of this out, for questioning why we can't have clean and safe subways, I mean, the bar has really become that low in the United States, then what you're really arguing, again, and if your response is the GDP and all these things, and what you're really arguing is that America's just an economic zone. You can't want a better country or a better system. It's nothing more than per capita media income, and American citizens are nothing more than economic tools who have to go to work every day, and as long as they increase GDP, who cares? Who cares what they pay for gas? Who cares what they pay for groceries? Our GDP is higher than theirs, so stop complaining. I mean, that's essentially what these people are arguing. You can learn a lot about the way people react to things. And that's why so many in our political and media elite in Washington and New York were so upset by Tucker's reporting. If you think we should have clean and safe subways like the ones we saw in Moscow, that, to these people, is by definition an attack on the status quo in our country. Because to agree with what Tucker showed, or to agree even with part of what you saw, is an indictment of our country. It's an indictment of the leaders who run our country. And as petty as that personal as that sounds, there's nothing they hate more than being exposed for their own mediocrity and their own lies.